White cop lies about Latina woman in court, not knowing she's a decorated Air Force pilot. You underestimated me, Officer Reynolds. But the truth always finds a way. What could make a courtroom fall silent in shock? A police officer accuses a Latina woman of resisting arrest and assault. His story convincing until she takes the stand and turns the entire case upside down. Who is she, and why does her testimony leave the officer, the jury, and even the judge stunned? This is the story of how one lie unraveled, and a fight for justice became a fight for truth. Let's dive into it. The early morning sun peeked through the heavy drapes of the courtroom, casting long shadows across the polished wooden floor. The room, though grand in design, felt suffocating. Rows of wooden benches were filled with a mix of spectators, curious townsfolk, journalists jotting notes, and a few faces lined with quiet tension among them. Sat Elena Cruz, her calm exterior betraying none of the turmoil beneath the surface. Her warm olive skin glowed faintly under the artificial light, and her neatly braided hair rested on her shoulders. Elena sat upright, her back straight as if guided by an invisible string, her hands clasped lightly in front of her. She was dressed modestly in a crisp white blouse and black slacks, a deliberate choice to exude humility and respect. Yet her sharp eyes scanned the room with precision, taking in every face, every movement. To the casual observer, she looked like any other defendant. But to those paying close attention, there was something unusual about her. A quiet intensity that seemed out of place for someone accused of a violent crime. The bailiff called the court to order, and all eyes turned to the front of the room, where Judge Alan Whitaker, an older white man with thinning silver hair, entered. He carried an air of authority, though his face betrayed a weariness that came from years of presiding over cases. He'd rather forget this one, however, which seemed to ignite a spark of interest in him. Perhaps it was the presence of Officer Derek Reynolds, sitting smugly at the plaintiff's table, or the murmurings of a case that had already captured the attention of local news outlets. State versus Elena Cruz, the bailiff announced, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. Elena rose, her movements deliberate and controlled, and faced the judge. The whispers in the room grew louder as people craned their necks for a better view. Officer Reynolds leaned back in his chair, his expression one of confidence, almost amusement. Dressed sharply in his police uniform, the officer exuded the kind of arrogance that comes from years of unquestioned authority. Elena's lawyer, Marcus Hayes, a young Latino attorney fresh out of law school, shuffled nervously through his notes. He glanced at Elena, hoping to find reassurance in her face, but she didn't return the look. Her eyes remained fixed on the judge, her expression unreadable. Hayes took a deep breath and stood. "Your Honor," he began, his voice wavering slightly, "we are prepared to proceed." The judge nodded, his gaze shifting to Reynolds. "Officer Reynolds, you may take the stand." The officer rose, every movement exaggerated, as if he were performing for an unseen audience. He adjusted his uniform before making his way to the witness stand, pausing briefly to glance at Elena. His smirk was faint but unmistakable, a predator sure of his prey. As he took the oath, Elena studied him. She observed the way his fingers fidgeted slightly, the subtle shift in his posture as he sat down. These were details most would overlook, but Elena cataloged them with the precision of someone trained to read body language. She didn't flinch, didn't move, as Reynolds began to speak on the evening in question. Reynolds began, his voice steady and loud enough to carry across the room. "I was responding to a disturbance call near the east side of town. I encountered the defendant, Miss Cruz, loitering outside a closed business. There were murmurs in the courtroom. Loitering was often used as a catch-all accusation, especially against people of color." Reynolds pressed on, seemingly unfazed. "When I approached her and asked what she was doing there, she immediately became hostile." He continued, his tone taking on a theatrical quality. "She refused to identify herself, raised her voice, and when I attempted to de-escalate the situation, she physically assaulted me." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Elena remained still, her face a mask of calm. Reynolds shifted in his seat, feigning a pained expression. "She hit me in the chest and attempted to reach for my service weapon. At that point, I had no choice but to restrain her." From the back of the room, a woman's voice muttered, "Sounds like a lie." Heads turned, but the judge quickly called for order. Thank you, Officer Reynolds, Judge Whitaker said, his voice neutral. You may step down. Elena's lawyer rose, visibly nervous. Your Honor, before we continue, I'd like to ask the court to consider. Save it for your cross-examination, Mr. Hayes, the judge interrupted. Let's move on. Elena exhaled softly. Her patience was being tested, but she didn't let it show. She leaned slightly toward Hayes, whispering, Stay calm, focus on the facts. Hayes nodded, though he looked far from reassured. As the prosecution rested its case, the atmosphere in the courtroom grew heavier. Reynolds returned to his seat, his smirk now a full grin. He exchanged a glance with his fellow officers seated in the back row. Elena didn't miss the wink he gave them. Miss Cruz, the judge said, his tone carrying an edge of skepticism. It's your turn to testify. Elena stood, smoothing her blouse as she approached the stand. The room fell silent as she took her seat, the weight of 100 stares pressing down on her. She adjusted the microphone in front of her, her movements slow and deliberate. Miss Cruz, the prosecutor began, a middle-aged man with a sharp suit and sharper tongue. Can you explain your actions on the night in question? Elena leaned forward slightly, her voice steady and measured. I can, but first I need to clarify one thing. The officer's account is not only inaccurate but intentionally misleading. There was a collective intake of breath. The prosecutor smirked. Bold accusation, Miss Cruz. Do you have any proof to back it up? Elena met his gaze, her dark eyes unyielding. I believe the truth will come to light soon enough. The prosecutor opened his mouth to retort, but Elena's calm confidence left him momentarily speechless. Judge Whitaker cleared his throat, signaling for the questioning to continue as Elena began to recount her version of events. The tension in the room became palpable. The audience hung on her every word, sensing that this was no ordinary defendant. Unbeknownst to everyone, the wheels of justice were already turning, and the carefully constructed lies of Officer Reynolds were beginning to unravel. Elena sat on the stand, her posture as unwavering as her composure. She took a moment before speaking, her hands resting lightly on the edge of the wooden railing. The courtroom silence was suffocating, every breath held in anticipation of what she might say. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was calm but carried an undeniable strength. On the night in question, she began, her eyes sweeping across the courtroom. I was on my way home from visiting a friend. I stopped near the corner of Valencia and 14th to check my phone for directions. She paused briefly, allowing the detail to sink in. That's when Officer Reynolds approached me. The prosecutor leaned forward, ready to pounce. And you're saying this encounter was completely unprovoked? Elena tilted her head slightly, her expression unwavering. Not entirely. I was standing on the sidewalk, which as far as I know isn't illegal. He approached me with his flashlight pointed directly at my face and asked in a tone I wouldn't call friendly what I was doing there. And how did you respond? The prosecutor asked, his voice tinged with skepticism. I told him I was checking directions, Elena replied evenly. He asked for my identification. I asked if I'd done anything wrong. The prosecutor seized the moment. So you questioned his authority? I questioned his motive, Elena corrected, her voice firm but not aggressive. I wasn't obstructing traffic, trespassing, or causing any disturbance. I wanted to know why he was asking for my ID. There was a ripple of murmurs in the courtroom. Judge Whitaker banged his gavel lightly. Order in the court. Elena continued, her tone unchanging. When I asked for clarification, he raised his voice and accused me of being uncooperative. I told him I wasn't trying to cause any trouble, but before I could say anything else, he grabbed my arm. Her words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. The prosecutor raised an eyebrow, clearly trying to decide how to twist her testimony to his advantage. Are you claiming the officer physically restrained you without cause? Elena nodded. Yes, and when I told him to let go, he tightened his grip. He said, and I quote, "Women like you need to learn how to listen." Gasps erupted from the gallery. This time the judge's gavel came down harder. Order. I will not tolerate interruptions. The prosecutor forced a smile. Miss Cruz, that's a serious allegation. Do you have any proof of this statement? Elena looked directly at him, her gaze unflinching. No, because the body camera he was wearing conveniently malfunctioned. Isn't that right, Officer Reynolds? All eyes turned to Reynolds, who shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His confident smirk had faded, replaced by a slight clenching of his jaw. The prosecutor cleared his throat. Let's focus on the facts, Miss Cruz. You claim the officer restrained you. What happened next? Elena folded her hands in her lap, her voice steady, despite the weight of the moment. I told him I didn't consent to being touched and asked him to let me go. He didn't. Instead, he accused me of resisting arrest, even though I hadn't moved. When I tried to pull my arm away, he slammed me against the patrol car. Her words were a punch to the gut for everyone listening. A few people in the audience whispered to one another, their faces a mixture of disbelief and anger. The tension in the room was thick, and even the judge seemed momentarily taken aback. And after that, the prosecutor pressed, his tone more subdued now. Elena's gaze didn't waver. He handcuffed me and told me I was under arrest for assaulting an officer. The prosecutor leaned back, trying to regain control of the narrative. Miss Cruz, you're a strong woman. Is it possible the officer felt threatened by your physical resistance? Elena didn't flinch. I'm not stronger than a trained police officer, and let's be clear, I didn't resist until he violated my rights. The prosecutor opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, Elena added, I also didn't reach for his weapon. Despite his claims, that was a fabrication to justify his use of force. The room seemed to freeze. Reynolds shifted again, visibly uneasy. The prosecutor's face darkened as he struggled to maintain his composure. Miss Cruz, he said, his voice tight, you're asking this court to believe that Officer Reynolds, a decorated member of the force, fabricated an entire incident. Do you have anything to back up your version of events? Elena smiled faintly, a subtle but powerful shift in her demeanor. The truth always has a way of revealing itself, counselor. You'll see soon enough. The judge leaned forward. Miss Cruz, are you implying there is evidence the court has not yet seen? Elena's lawyer, Marcus Hayes, stood quickly. Your Honor, we intend to submit additional evidence during the proceedings. The prosecutor scoffed. More stalling tactics, Your Honor. If the defense had anything substantial, they would have presented it already. Elena turned to face the judge. Your Honor, the truth takes time, but I promise you this, when it comes out, it will be undeniable. The judge studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he nodded. Very well. We'll reset for today. Court will reconvene tomorrow at 9 a.m. As the gavel came down, the courtroom erupted into whispers. Elena rose from the stand, her movements calm and deliberate. She walked past Officer Reynolds, who avoided her gaze, and joined her lawyer at the defense table. Are you sure about this? Hayes whispered, his voice filled with doubt. Elena placed a hand on his arm, her grip steady and reassuring. Trust me, Marcus. Tomorrow, the truth will speak louder than anything Reynolds could ever say. As she walked out of the courtroom, the murmurs of the crowd followed her, a mix of curiosity and speculation. Outside, the sun was setting, casting the town in a warm, golden glow. Elena paused on the courthouse steps, her eyes scanning the horizon. The fight was far from over, but she was ready. She had always been ready. The courthouse emptied slowly, the day's tensions still clinging to the air like a heavy fog. Elena stood at the edge of the courthouse steps, her silhouette framed against the orange hues of the setting sun. The hum of conversation and the shuffle of feet surrounded her. But she tuned it all out, her focus inward. She had faced tougher battles before, ones where survival wasn't guaranteed. But there was something uniquely suffocating about fighting in a courtroom where the truth could be buried under lies. Marcus Hayes appeared at her side, his face a portrait of concern. The young lawyer clutched his briefcase tightly, as if it contained not just papers but the weight of his responsibility to her. Elena, he said hesitantly, his voice low enough to avoid drawing attention. We need to talk. She turned her head slightly, her gaze calm but unyielding. What's on your mind, Marcus? He exhaled deeply, his breath visible in the cool evening air. You have to tell me what you're holding back. The judge knows it. The prosecutor knows it. And Reynolds, he's getting nervous. Whatever ace you're hiding, I need to know before we walk back into that courtroom tomorrow. Elena's lips curved into the faintest of smiles. You'll know when the time is right. That's not enough, he pressed, lowering his voice even further. I'm your lawyer. If we're going to win this, I need to be prepared for whatever bombshell you're planning to drop. She studied him for a moment, the weight of her silence pressing down on him like a physical force. Finally, she nodded. Meet me at my house tonight. I'll tell you everything. Marcus blinked, startled by the sudden shift. You will? I will, she said firmly. But not here. Elena's modest home sat on the outskirts of town, surrounded by tall oak trees that swayed gently in the night breeze. The faint glow of a porch light illuminated the walkway, casting long shadows across the gravel path. Marcus pulled up in his car, stepping out cautiously. The quiet of the area was almost unnerving after the chaos of the courtroom. He knocked lightly on the door, and Elena answered almost immediately, as though she'd been standing there waiting. She wore a simple navy sweatshirt and black leggings, a stark contrast to the poised appearance she'd maintained earlier in the day. Her hair was tied back, and her expression was unreadable. "Come in," she said, stepping aside. Marcus entered, his eyes scanning the space. The living room was neat and sparsely decorated, with only a few personal touches. A framed photograph of a younger Elena in an Air Force uniform, her arm around an older man in a similar uniform, a folded American flag displayed in a glass case on the mantel, a bookshelf filled with titles on leadership, strategy, and history. "You live alone?" he asked, more out of curiosity than anything else. "For now," she replied, gesturing for him to sit on the couch. "It's quieter than I'm used to. Civilian life moves slower, sometimes too slow. The silence doesn't always feel like peace." There was a pause, a beat of shared understanding Marcus didn't try to fill with words. "Drink?" "No, I'm fine," he said, sitting down stiffly and setting his briefcase at his feet. "I'm here for answers, Elena, no distractions." She smirked faintly, appreciating his determination. "Fair enough." She moved to the bookshelf, pulling out a leather-bound folder. It was war-worn but well-maintained, the edges frayed slightly from years of use. She placed it on the coffee table in front of him and sat across from him in a chair. Marcus eyed the folder but didn't reach for it. "What's this?" "My service record," she said simply. "Everything you need to know about me." He hesitated. "You're serious? You're just giving it to me?" "You're my lawyer," she said. "You need to know who you're defending." Marcus opened the folder carefully, his fingers brushing against the pages. Inside were neatly organized documents. Discharge papers, commendations, training certifications. His eyes widened as he scanned the contents. "Wait," he muttered, flipping through the pages faster. "You were an Air Force pilot?" she finished for him. "Lieutenant Colonel, retired." He stared at her, his mouth slightly open. "Elena, this changes everything. Why didn't you tell me before?" "Because it's not just about who I was," she said, leaning forward. "It's about what Reynolds represents. This isn't just my fight, Marcus. It's about exposing the kind of corruption and bias that allows people like him to get away with this." Marcus ran a hand through his hair, his mind racing. The prosecutor's going to lose it when this comes out. And Reynolds, he'll crumble. Elena's expression darkened. "Reynolds won't crumble. Men like him double down when they're cornered. That's why we have to be smart, strategic." Marcus nodded slowly, understanding the gravity of her words. "Do you think he knows?" "Not yet," she said. "But he's suspicious. You saw how he looked at me today. He knows there's something he doesn't know, and it's eating at him." Marcus closed the folder and leaned back, letting out a long breath. "So what's the plan?" Elena's eyes glinted with a quiet determination. "Tomorrow we show the court the truth. But we don't just expose Reynolds for lying. We expose the system that enables him." "And how do we do that?" he asked, leaning forward. Elena stood, her presence commanding even in her casual attire. She walked to the mantel, picking up the folded flag. She turned it over in her hands before looking back at him. "We make them see me not as a defendant, but as the woman who spent 20 years protecting the very freedoms that man tried to strip from me." Her voice was steady, but there was an edge to it, a quiet storm brewing beneath her calm exterior. Marcus felt a chill run down his spine, not from fear, but from the sheer force of her resolve. "Elena," he said softly, "tomorrow's going to be a fight." She placed the flag back on the mantel, her hand lingering on it for a moment. Then she turned to him, her eyes fierce. "I've been fighting my whole life, Marcus. Tomorrow's just another battle." The next morning, the courthouse loomed in the pale gray light of dawn, its imposing facade casting long shadows over the bustling crowd that had gathered on the steps. News of the trial had spread quickly overnight, whispers turning into a roar of speculation. The gallery was filled with spectators. journalists scribbling in notepads, community members eager to see justice, and Reynolds's fellow officers, who lined the back row in a silent show of support for their comrade. Inside, the courtroom hummed with anticipation, the atmosphere tense and electric. Elena sat at the defense table, her expression calm but focused. Her navy blue blazer and neatly pressed white shirt gave her a commanding presence, one that seemed to silence the room even before the judge entered. Beside her, Marcus Hayes flipped through his notes, his nerves betrayed by the subtle tapping of his pen against the table. "Are you ready for this?" he asked in a low voice, glancing at her. Elena turned her head slightly, her gaze steady. "I've been ready for years, Marcus. Let's give them the truth." The gavel struck, and Judge Whitaker entered the room, his stern face surveying the crowd. "Court is now in session. We will continue with the case of State versus Elena Cruz." The prosecutor, a seasoned man with sharp features and a suit that seemed tailored to intimidate, stood first. "Your Honor, we intend to reinforce the testimony of Officer Reynolds today and present additional evidence to support the charges against the defendant." Elena didn't flinch, her hands resting lightly on the table. She could feel the eyes of the room on her, but she remained as steady as a rock in the tide. The prosecutor called Reynolds to the stand again, his polished demeanor masking the growing tension in the room. Reynolds adjusted his tie as he walked to the stand, his movements slower than usual, as if weighed down by the scrutiny he could feel pressing in from every angle. "Officer Reynolds," the prosecutor began, his voice firm but measured, "please remind the court of the events that led to the defendant's arrest." Reynolds cleared his throat, his voice carrying a hint of strain. "As I stated before, I encountered the defendant near a closed business. She was acting suspiciously, refused to identify herself, and became physically aggressive when I attempted to question her. And you stand by your account of her behavior?" the prosecutor pressed. "I do," Reynolds replied, his eyes flicking toward Elena for the briefest of moments. The prosecutor nodded, satisfied. "Thank you, Officer Reynolds. No further questions." Marcus rose slowly, his expression unreadable. He adjusted his tie and approached the stand with deliberate steps, each one echoing in the silent courtroom. "Officer Reynolds," Marcus began, his voice calm but carrying an edge that made Reynolds shift slightly in his seat. "You testified that my client became aggressive and attempted to reach for your weapon. Is that correct?" "That's correct," Reynolds replied, his voice steady but his posture rigid. "And yet," Marcus continued, "you also stated that your body camera malfunctioned during the incident. Convenient, wouldn't you say?" Reynolds' jaw tightened. It was an unfortunate coincidence. "Equipment malfunctions happen." "Of course they do," Marcus said, nodding slightly. "But you've been on the force for what, 10 years? How often has your body camera malfunctioned during an arrest?" Reynolds hesitated, his eyes narrowing. "Not often, but it happened this time." Marcus pressed, "During an arrest where you claim the defendant behaved so aggressively that you feared for your safety?" "Yes," Reynolds said, his voice hardening. Marcus turned, pacing slowly in front of the jury. "And is it also a coincidence, Officer Reynolds, that a witness in the area captured part of this encounter on their phone?" The courtroom erupted into whispers, the gallery leaning forward as if they could will the evidence into existence. Judge Whitaker struck his gavel, demanding order. "Mr. Hayes," the judge said, his voice sharp, "if you have evidence, present it." Marcus returned to the defense table, retrieving a USB drive. "Your Honor, the defense submits video evidence recorded by a bystander during the arrest." The prosecutor shot to his feet. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. The defense should have submitted this earlier." "Sit down," Judge Whitaker interrupted, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Let's see the footage." The bailiff took the drive and inserted it into the courtroom's media system. The screen on the wall flickered to life, and the room fell into a heavy silence. The footage was shaky, the angle partially obscured by the frame of a car window, but the audio was clear. Reynolds' voice rang out, sharp and commanding. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be," he said, his hand gripping Elena's arm. Her voice followed, calm but firm. "I'm not resisting. Let go of my arm." The crowd watched, riveted, as Reynolds shoved Elena against the patrol car. His words were clear now, biting and unmistakable. "Women like you don't get to question me." The courtroom erupted again, louder this time. The judge banged his gavel repeatedly, his face darkening with frustration. Order. I will have order in this court. The courtroom emptied slowly for recess, but the tension lingered in the air like a storm waiting to break. Elena sat silently at the defense table, her calm demeanor unshaken by the chaos the video evidence had unleashed. Beside her, Marcus was pacing, his hands moving in erratic gestures as he muttered under his breath. "This is huge, Elena," he said, finally stopping to face her. That footage just tore his testimony apart. Elena folded her hands neatly on the table, her gaze steady. "It's a crack in the wall, Marcus, but walls don't fall with cracks alone. We need more." Marcus exhaled sharply, leaning on the table. "What's the next move? We've got the video, and you've got your service record. We could bury Reynolds with this." She looked at him, her expression softening just slightly. "It's not just about burying Reynolds, it's about exposing the truth. If we rush, we risk losing control of the narrative. Timing is everything." Before Marcus could respond, the bailiff's voice cut through the room. "Court will reconvene in 5 minutes." Elena stood, adjusting her blazer. "Stay sharp, Marcus. It's time." As the judge entered and the room was called to order, all eyes were on Officer Reynolds. The confident smirk he had worn earlier was gone, replaced by a tight-lipped expression and darting eyes that betrayed his growing unease. His fellow officers in the back row exchanged uncertain glances, their silent support now tinged with doubt. Judge Whitaker's voice broke through the tension. "Mr. Hayes, do you have additional evidence to present?" Marcus rose, his movements deliberate and composed. "Yes, Your Honor. The defense would like to call the defendant, Elena Cruz, to the stand." The room buzzed with renewed interest. Elena stood, her steps measured as she approached the witness stand. She didn't rush, didn't falter. Her presence alone seemed to command the room's attention, and when she sat, her posture was as straight as a soldier at attention. "Miss Cruz," Marcus began, his tone steady, "you've heard the accusations against you, resisting arrest, assaulting an officer, attempting to seize a weapon. Are these accusations true?" "No, they are not," Elena replied firmly, her voice carrying across the room. Marcus nodded. "Then let's talk about what really happened that night. In your own words, tell the court how your encounter with Officer Reynolds unfolded." Elena took a slow breath, her gaze sweeping the room before settling on Marcus. "That night I was heading home after visiting a friend. I stopped to check my phone for directions when Officer Reynolds approached me. He asked what I was doing there, and I told him. When he asked for my ID, I questioned why he needed it. I wasn't doing anything illegal, and I wanted to know what his reasoning was. And how did he respond?" Marcus asked. Elena's jaw tightened slightly. "He accused me of being uncooperative. When I tried to explain myself, he grabbed my arm and refused to let go despite me telling him I hadn't done anything wrong." Marcus took a step closer to the jury, his voice rising slightly. "Did you threaten him in any way?" "No," Elena said firmly. "I told him to let go of my arm. When I tried to pull away, he shoved me against the patrol car and handcuffed me. He then accused me of reaching for his weapon, which is a complete fabrication." The gallery murmured again, but Elena wasn't finished. "His actions weren't about law enforcement," she continued, her voice steady but charged with emotion. "They were about control, about asserting power over someone he assumed couldn't fight back." Marcus paused, letting her words hang in the air. "Miss Cruz, there's been a lot of speculation about your background. The prosecution has painted you as an ordinary civilian who suddenly turned violent. Is there more to your story that the court should know?" Elena's eyes met Marcus's, and for the first time her calm exterior gave way to a flicker of something deeper: resolve, strength, and perhaps a hint of anger. "Yes," she said, her voice carrying the weight of decades of experience. "There is more." The room held its collective breath as Elena leaned forward slightly, her hands resting on the edge of the stand. "I am Lieutenant Colonel Elena Cruz, retired Air Force," she announced, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "I served my country for 20 years, including in some of the most dangerous combat zones in the world. I've led teams on missions that required discipline, precision, and strength, qualities that I carry with me every day." Gasps rippled through the courtroom, followed by a stunned silence. Even Judge Whitaker seemed momentarily taken aback, his gavel frozen in midair. Reynolds' face turned pale, his jaw tightening as if he were physically holding back his reaction. Marcus stepped forward, his voice rising. Miss Cruz, as an Air Force officer, you were trained to handle high-pressure situations. Did you use any of that training during your encounter with Officer Reynolds? Yes, Elena said without hesitation. I used it to stay calm, to de-escalate the situation, and to protect myself from harm without resorting to violence. And did you at any point attempt to harm Officer Reynolds or reach for his weapon? Marcus asked. No, Elena said, her voice firm. My training taught me how to assess threats and respond appropriately. Reynolds wasn't a threat to my safety. He was a threat to my dignity, and I refused to let him strip me of that. The courtroom erupted once more, louder this time, as the weight of Elena's words settled over the room. The judge banged his gavel repeatedly, his face a mixture of frustration and awe. Order. I will have order in this court. When the noise subsided, Marcus turned to the jury, his voice steady but filled with conviction. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you've heard Officer Reynolds' version of events, and now you've heard the truth from a woman who has spent her life defending this country. The question you need to ask yourselves is simple. Who do you believe? The prosecutor remained seated, his face pale and his eyes fixed on the table in front of him. Reynolds stared straight ahead, his hands clenched tightly on the arms of his chair. As Elena stepped down from the stand, the weight of her testimony lingered in the room. She returned to her seat, her head held high, and leaned toward Marcus. Now, she said softly, let's see how long that wall holds. The tension in the courtroom was almost suffocating. Officer Derek Reynolds sat at the plaintiff's table, his face pale and glistening with a sheen of sweat. The composure he had carried into the courtroom earlier was gone, replaced by the faint tremble in his hands as he gripped the edge of the table. His fellow officers, who had been a silent wall of support in the back row, exchanged uneasy glances. They had come to see justice served, or so they thought. But now doubts were creeping into their minds like unwelcome shadows. The judge, his usually stoic face showing hints of wariness, looked over the room before turning to Reynolds' lawyer, Mr. Avery. Does the prosecution wish to proceed with redirect, or do you need a moment to reconsider your strategy? The prosecutor, Richard Avery, rose stiffly from his seat, his carefully curated demeanor showing the first signs of a crack. He adjusted his tie as if tightening a noose and stepped toward the witness stand. His voice, usually sharp and commanding, carried a faint edge of desperation. Your Honor, he began, we intend to call Officer Reynolds back to the stand to clarify some inconsistencies. The judge nodded, his eyes narrowing slightly. Proceed. Reynolds stood slowly, his movements stiff as though weighed down by the growing scrutiny. As he walked to the witness stand, he avoided Elena's gaze, which followed him with a calm intensity. When he finally sat down, his hand trembled as he adjusted the microphone, a gesture that didn't go unnoticed by the jury. Avery approached, forcing a smile. Officer Reynolds, you've heard the defendant's testimony and her claims regarding your conduct. Do you have anything to say in response? Reynolds cleared his throat, his voice shaky but determined. Yes, her account of the incident is exaggerated. I acted within the scope of my duties. Avery nodded encouragingly. And the video evidence presented earlier, how do you explain what the court saw? Reynolds hesitated, his eyes darting toward the jury before returning to Avery. The video doesn't show everything. It's incomplete. It doesn't capture the context of her behavior leading up to that moment. And what context would that be? Avery pressed, his tone tightening. She was defiant, Reynolds said, his voice growing louder as if to regain some control. She refused to cooperate and challenged my authority. I had to act decisively to maintain order. Elena watched him with an expression that was almost pitying, her hands folded neatly on the table in front of her. Marcus leaned toward her and whispered, "He's unraveling." She gave a small nod but said nothing, her focus unwavering. Avery continued, his voice growing more insistent. So you stand by your claim that the defendant attempted to reach for your weapon? Yes, Reynolds said, though the word came out weaker than he intended. She made a sudden movement toward my side. I had to protect myself. Marcus shot to his feet. Your Honor, permission to cross-examine. Judge Whitaker nodded curtly. Granted. Marcus approached the stand, slowly, his movements deliberate. He stopped just a few feet from Reynolds, his presence looming without being overbearing. He let the silence hang in the air for a moment, forcing Reynolds to meet his gaze. "Officer Reynolds," Marcus began, his tone calm but edged with steel. "You've testified multiple times that my client reached for your weapon. Is that correct?" "Yes," Reynolds replied, though his voice lacked its earlier conviction. "And yet," Marcus continued, "you provided no physical evidence to support this claim. No fingerprints on your holster, no corroborating testimony, just your word." Reynolds' jaw tightened. "I know what I saw." Marcus nodded slowly, as though considering the statement. "You know what you saw," he repeated. "But the court has seen something else, video evidence that contradicts your account. Evidence that shows my client was calm and cooperative until you escalated the situation." "That video doesn't tell the whole story," Reynolds said, his voice rising. "It's taken out of context." Marcus tilted his head slightly. "Out of context?" "Let's talk about context then." He turned to the jury, his voice growing louder. "This is a man who approached a law-abiding citizen, demanded her identification without cause, and when questioned, resorted to force, a man who then lied under oath to cover his actions." The prosecutor objected, but the judge overruled him, motioning for Marcus to continue. Marcus turned back to Reynolds, his voice dropping to a cold, quiet tone. "Officer Reynolds, you accused a decorated Air Force officer, a woman who has served this country with honor, of being a threat. Tell me, does it embarrass you to know that the person you tried to intimidate has faced dangers you couldn't begin to imagine?" Reynolds flinched, his composure slipping further. "That's irrelevant. She wasn't acting like an Air Force officer that night. And you weren't acting like a police officer," Marcus shot back, his voice sharp. "You were acting like a bully who thought he could get away with abusing his authority. But you didn't count on her standing up to you, did you?" The room was deathly silent, the weight of Marcus's words pressing down on everyone present. Reynolds opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. Marcus turned to the judge. "Your Honor, I have no further questions." Reynolds stepped down from the stand, his shoulders slumped as he returned to his seat. His fellow officers avoided his gaze, their earlier confidence in him now replaced with doubt. Elena watched him for a moment before leaning toward Marcus, the walls starting to crumble. Marcus nodded, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Let's finish the job." The courtroom was heavy with silence. As Officer Derek Reynolds returned to his seat, his confident facade had crumbled, and he now looked like a man walking the edge of a crumbling cliff. The air in the room was dense, charged with unspoken tension. The jury exchanged glances, their expressions betraying growing unease. Even the judge, typically stoic and detached, leaned forward slightly as though sensing the tide turning in ways even he hadn't anticipated. At the defense table, Elena sat unmoving, her composure a stark contrast to Reynolds' unraveling. Her calm presence had begun to feel almost imposing, a quiet strength that filled the room more effectively than any words could. Marcus Hayes flipped through his notes one last time, his jaw tightening in determination. This wasn't just a case to him anymore. It was a reckoning. Judge Whitaker cleared his throat, breaking the tense silence. "Mr. Hayes," he said, his voice carrying a note of caution. "The defense may proceed." Marcus stood, buttoning his jacket before addressing the court. "Your Honor, the defense has one final piece of evidence to present, evidence that will leave no doubt as to what truly happened on the night of my client's arrest." The gallery buzzed with whispers, the spectators craning their necks to see what would come next. Reynolds shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his knuckles white as he gripped the table. The prosecutor, Richard Avery, visibly tensed, his earlier confidence replaced with wary suspicion. Elena remained still, her gaze steady as Marcus retrieved a file from his briefcase. He held it aloft for the jury to see. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, his voice steady but firm, "what you've heard in this courtroom over the past few days is a tale of two stories. Officer Reynolds would have you believe that my client, a woman with no prior criminal record and a career dedicated to serving her country, suddenly became violent and aggressive for no reason. But the truth is far simpler and far more troubling." He opened the file and pulled out a series of documents. "This," he said, holding up the first page, "is Officer Reynolds' personnel record. and what it reveals is a pattern of behavior that speaks to his credibility, or rather, his lack of it. The prosecutor leapt to his feet. "Your Honor, I object. This is irrelevant to the case at hand." Judge Whitaker raised a hand to silence him. Overruled. "Mr. Hayes, you may continue." Marcus nodded and addressed the jury directly. Over the course of his career, Officer Reynolds has been the subject of multiple complaints: excessive force, racial bias, improper conduct. These complaints were either ignored or buried by the department. But today, they come to light. He handed copies of the documents to the jury, who studied them intently. The murmurs in the gallery grew louder, and even the judge's expression darkened as he scanned the pages in front of him. "Let me be clear," Marcus said, his voice rising slightly. "This is not just about one bad decision. This is about a pattern of abuse, a pattern that culminated in the false arrest and mistreatment of my client." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the room before turning toward Elena. "And now it's time for her to speak her truth." Elena rose slowly, her movements deliberate and controlled. She walked to the front of the courtroom, standing tall and commanding as she addressed the jury. "My name is Lieutenant Colonel Elena Cruz," she began, her voice clear and steady. "For 20 years, I served in the United States Air Force as a pilot. I've been to places most people can't imagine, faced dangers most people will never know. And through it all, I've held myself to the highest standards of integrity and discipline." Her eyes swept over the jury, each word carrying the weight of her experience. "I have faced enemies on the battlefield, but I never thought I would face one in my own country. That night, I wasn't a threat. I wasn't breaking any laws. I was simply existing, something that, for people like me, often feels like a crime in itself." The gallery was silent now, the earlier murmurs replaced by a palpable sense of shame and reflection. Elena continued, her voice unwavering. "Officer Reynolds didn't see me as a person. He saw me as a target, a means to assert his power and control. But what he didn't see was my strength, my resolve, and my refusal to be silenced." She turned to face Reynolds directly, her gaze piercing. "You underestimated me, Officer Reynolds, but more importantly, you underestimated the truth. And the truth has a way of coming to light." Reynolds looked away, his face flushed with humiliation. The jury's eyes followed Elena, their expressions a mixture of awe and anger, not at her, but at the system that had allowed this to happen. Elena turned back to the judge. "Your Honor, I fought for this country. I fought for justice. And I'm here today to fight not just for myself, but for every person who has ever been wronged by those sworn to protect them." The room erupted into applause, despite the judge's gavel striking repeatedly. "Order," Judge Whitaker barked, though even he couldn't hide the respect in his eyes as he looked at Elena. Marcus stepped forward, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Thank you, Lieutenant Colonel Cruz. No further questions." As Elena returned to her seat, the energy in the courtroom shifted. The jury looked at her with newfound respect, their earlier skepticism replaced by conviction. Reynolds, on the other hand, seemed to shrink in his chair, his earlier bravado now a distant memory. Judge Whitaker leaned forward, his voice heavy with finality. "We will now move to closing arguments, and I suggest both parties choose their words carefully." The courtroom felt like it was holding its breath. The tension was thick, the silence heavy, as the prosecutor, Richard Avery, rose to deliver his closing argument. He adjusted his tie nervously and approached the jury, his usual confidence replaced with a strained composure. "Ladies and gentlemen," Avery began, his voice measured but lacking its earlier vigor. "What we've seen here today is a complex case. While the defense has worked hard to paint Officer Reynolds as a man with a questionable record, I urge you to consider the broader picture. Law enforcement officers make split-second decisions are made every day, often under difficult circumstances. Officer Reynolds believes he was acting in the best interest of public safety." He paused, his gaze flickering toward Reynolds, whose face was a pale mask of unease. "Mistakes may have been made," Avery admitted, "but that does not change the fact that Officer Reynolds was doing his job." The defense's claims, while compelling, do not erase the fact that the defendant questioned authority, resisted an officer, and escalated the situation. Avery's tone hardened as he finished. "I ask you to consider the facts and not be swayed by emotion or spectacle." "Thank you." The courtroom remained silent as he returned to his seat. Marcus Hayes rose next, his movements deliberate and calm. He adjusted his jacket, straightened his tie, and approached the jury with an air of quiet confidence. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Marcus began, his voice steady and firm. "What we've seen here today is not a complex case. It is, in fact, painfully simple. My client, Lieutenant Colonel Elena Cruz, a decorated Air Force officer and an American hero, was profiled, mistreated, and lied about by a man who abused his power." He turned, gesturing toward Elena, who sat with her back straight, her hands resting lightly on the table. Elena Cruz did not resist arrest. She did not threaten Officer Reynolds. What she did was ask a question, a simple, reasonable question. Why? And for that, she was thrown against a car, handcuffed and humiliated. Marcus's voice rose, his passion filling the room. This isn't just about Elena Cruz. It's about accountability. It's about ensuring that those who wear a badge and swear an oath to protect and serve are held to the highest standards of integrity, because when they fail to do so, the entire system fails. He took a step closer to the jury, lowering his voice for emphasis. Today, you have the power to send a message that no one, not even an officer of the law, is above accountability. That justice is not just a word we say, but a principle we uphold. I trust you to make the right decision. Marcus returned to his seat, and the courtroom fell into a heavy silence. As Judge Whitaker gave his instructions to the jury, then they were dismissed to deliberate. The hours felt like days. Elena sat in the courthouse hallway, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Marcus paced back and forth, his brow furrowed in thought. The low hum of conversation from nearby spectators and reporters filled the space, but Elena tuned it all out. "Do you think they'll see the truth?" Marcus asked, breaking the silence. Elena looked up at him, her expression calm but resolute. "They don't need to see it, Marcus. They need to feel it. The truth has a way of making itself known." Marcus nodded, though his nerves were evident. Before either of them could say more, the bailiff appeared in the doorway. "The jury has reached a verdict." The courtroom was packed as everyone filed back in, the tension almost unbearable. Elena stood beside Marcus at the defense table, her face an unreadable mask. Across the room, Reynolds sat stiffly, his eyes fixed on the jury box. The foreperson of the jury, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a serious expression, stood as the judge addressed her. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" "Yes, Your Honor," she replied, her voice steady. The judge nodded. "Please read the verdict." The foreperson unfolded a piece of paper and began. "In the case of State versus Elena Cruz, we find the defendant not guilty on all charges." A wave of emotion rippled through the room. Gasps, murmurs, and even a few quiet cheers broke out before the judge's gavel brought order. Elena exhaled softly, her shoulders relaxing for the first time in days. Marcus placed a hand on her shoulder, a smile breaking through his otherwise professional demeanor. The foreperson continued. "Furthermore, we the jury strongly recommend that an investigation into Officer Reynolds' conduct be pursued." The judge nodded gravely. "The court will take this recommendation under advisement. Officer Reynolds, I suggest you retain counsel." This matter is far from over. Outside the courthouse, the media swarmed, cameras flashing and microphones thrust forward, but Elena stood tall, her presence commanding as she addressed the crowd. "This isn't just my victory," she said, her voice steady but filled with conviction. "This is a victory for accountability, for justice, and for everyone who has ever been silenced by those in power. I didn't fight this battle alone, and I won't stop fighting for others." Marcus stood beside her, watching with a mixture of pride and admiration. The crowd erupted into applause as Elena turned and walked away, leaving the cameras behind. Months later, Officer Reynolds was dismissed from the police force and faced criminal charges for perjury and misconduct. His fellow officers, once loyal to him, distanced themselves as the investigation uncovered more of his abuses. Elena returned to her quiet life, but her name became a symbol of resilience and justice. She was invited to speak at events, her story inspiring others to stand up against injustice. Though she had left the battlefield years ago, Elena Cruz knew that her fight wasn't over, and she was ready for whatever came next, because for her, justice wasn't just an outcome, it was a way of life. And just like that, the truth prevailed. A courageous woman stood her ground, exposing lies and demanding justice in a system designed to silence her. This story isn't just about one victory. It's a reminder that standing up for what's right can change everything. If this story moved you, make sure to subscribe to my channel for more powerful stories like this one. Turn on notifications so you never miss an update, and join me as we uncover more tales of resilience, justice, and redemption. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.